Joshua Tree. So not only we're trying to solve the climate problem, and we're destroying part of the ecosystem in the process. And once the Joshua trees are gone, that's it for them. So my journey on this starts in a place, a very personal place, which has to do with violent removal and ethnic cleansing. So I've been studying that for a number of years. I've been studying current refugee camps and how people find and make place and community in them. And also resettlement communities. How do we invite people in, and how do we support them in reestablishing themselves and relieving their trauma in the process? So climate change relocation, internationally or nationally, is just a small part of this. My family history of violent removal, ethnic cleansing, this is actually a picture of my family. My mother's holding the basket. My great-grandfather's got the bag of potatoes. This is during the Second World War, and they were gleaning food out of the fields so that they could have something to eat. This is my mother and aunt in their kitchen. And my mother, the only time she ever talked about the trauma of leaving was the fact that she had to leave her cat behind. That's incredibly relatable, but also masks a lot of the trauma of violent ethnic cleansing. Fast forward a number of years to Canada. That's me with the red curls in the picture. And the garden is a prominent piece for our family of finding a place to be and finding relief from the trauma, and from the trauma of losing your home and losing literally everything. My mother was 17, my aunt was 10 when they lost everything. My grandmother was 45. So think about that in your terms, that you would suddenly lose everything that you have, and you can take what you've got on your body right now, and that's about it. And if you have any nice jewelry, it's gone. So this idea of movement has been studied in the psychological literature. And here's one scheme of the emotional volatility versus the disruption in time of ethnic cleansing and migration due to trauma. So you've got this pre-move period where the move is announced. You're being told that you're leaving. You go through shock, denial. During the move, you're angry. You are so angry that people have taken you out of your home. Then you start to bargain with yourself. Well, it won't be so bad. I'll find a place to be. Then you get depressed, seriously depressed. The amount of depression and self-harm is extremely high among refugee communities. And then you start to test. And then post-move, at least the early literature, this is 2004, the early literature says you get to a point of acceptance. The more recent literature, though, says it takes 3 generations to get to that point of final acceptance of the new home. And that's a long period of time to readjust and reacquaint. So if there is a way that we can reduce that trauma during the move, we should find it. So that's at the base of what I've been looking at. So where do people go? As Elizabeth said, the most vulnerable are the least able to move, and they're the most affected. You've got immediate moving, that's in the first month. You've got short-term, 6 months to 20 years or more, usually in a refugee or displacement community. And then long-term, you've got permanent relocations happening. So I started looking at current refugee camps where the average stay can be 17 years right now. Average stay. That means that kids are being born and growing up in refugee camps. If we can't make those into active supporting communities, then we are relegating that whole group of kids into not understanding how to function in society, in any kind of society. And then I've looked at the resettlement gardens, and there's a huge difference here between internally displaced people and refugees. At least I thought at the beginning. I'm going to come back to that difference between internally displaced and refugees, which in the international context means you go to another country. So my fundamental question is, how do we take home with us? And that means, what did people take with them? I started out thinking about what my parents took with them, and then started my research into what other people took with them and what the literature says they took with them. And they take their heritage. They take artifacts, things that you can carry in your pocket, oral traditions, practices, and an idealized place, which is the most important piece for us here. So, my husband's family, when they left Odessa in the Ukraine, took uncut diamonds that they could sew into their skirts, because that they could exchange for food. Not so much money, but food. Somebody was going to give them food for those uncut diamonds. And the family still has some of those uncut diamonds today. So artifacts, oral traditions, take the ability to make certain kinds of food that we are closely related to and really hunger for. When we did interviews in Zatri, refugee camp in Jordan, one of the most common comments was, we miss the Syrian sweets. And so there were people in the camp that had set up small businesses and traded rations for sugar and other ingredients for those sweets and made them and sold them in the camp. That's how important. I mean, sweets, it sounds like it's not that important to life, but it's fundamental to life. It's fundamental to really living. So, practices as well. This is a young girl, an Afghani woman. She's 15, in Moria detention camp in Greece, who I met, who is a fantastic artist. And what did she draw? Over and over in different forms and different types, but she drew the women and the traditional dress of the Afghani woman. And so we bring these things with us because we long for home. And she was one of the minors who was unaccompanied. And that happens a tremendous amount, particularly in the crossing of Afghani children, women, girls and boys, into Greece. There's a huge number of them that go across the water every year from Turkey and the mainland in that area. And then they bring an idealized place. They bring the physical memory of home. What does that mean? That means a particular landscape. It means trees, it means animals, it means the sound of birds. It means all of those things that we are in peril of losing due to climate change, right? For my grandmother, two most important things that she missed were the smell of linden trees blooming in the spring, in June. There is nothing like it. You get under a linden tree and inhale that smell, and it brings you right back to a certain location. The other thing was the storks coming back every spring to nest in her village. And she knew that she would never see a stork again, and she didn't. And that's a tremendous loss because you long for those things. You long for those rhythms of your home. So how do we maintain landscape heritage? How do we maintain this idea of place? So I started looking at community gardens as microcosms of what people were growing. And I looked not at the form of the garden, but what they were planting. And I found and how they were using the gardens. So people were using it for rest, for relaxation, just to enjoy the space in urban environments. They were using it to get married, but they were also planting a whole lot of stuff that was not food. When you look at community gardens manifestos, the goals, the reasons for being, it's about food security. When you look at what people plant, not so much about food security. I saw one woman's plot, she planted just potatoes. And I was like, wait a minute, potatoes? You can get organic potatoes in the store really cheap. Why are you planting potatoes? Because they reminded her of her father. And there was another woman who was from Iran before the Shah was deposed. And she grew all the roses in her entire community garden. She tended everybody's roses. Why? Because roses reminded her of home. And so when we look at what people are growing, food-wise or ornamental-wise, it's about that connection to home and to landscape. That is written up on this website, Women in Migration, that summarizes some of the interviews that I did in that period. And one of them is, we have a little plot here, but when we grow our food and fruit, we are proud and feel good because we can grow with our own hands. So that's not just the immigrant community, but it restores a sense of self and relieves that trauma of migration. So we look at this idea of a real home, moving to the new home. The real home, the old home, is about intangible heritage, the thoughts and ideas we bring with us, the tangible, movable, the uncut diamonds, and the immovable, which is the place. And we take that memory and turn it into action in the new home. Why? Because the psychological literature says sight, sound, taste, touch, smell are all fundamental to us as we develop as children. We learn how to understand our environment through those five senses. And that means those smells, those touches, the sights, the sounds, all become embedded into who we are. We organize them, we process, and we remember. And that lets us understand our place in the world. and that becomes fundamental to who we are. So food, how we cook it and what we eat, and then where we source our food. This is squid that's being dried in South Korea. How we preserve it, all of that is connected to our physical location. So when we look at refugee communities, they are vast, placeless locations and can often look like this. And this is Zatri in Jordan. And what we found at Zatri is that people create public spaces almost immediately with a little bit of a tarp and some packing crates, and they're ready to go to set up a little stand in the public space. They can also create shade and a sense of space here in the overall straight lines of shipping containers that people are living in. And then if you give them a little bit more autonomy into how to create their space, they're creating semi-public spaces that they can control and have some sense of ownership on. And the semi-public spaces include spaces like this, where they spend some of their rations. They trade them for the materials to make a fountain. Why? Because that fountain, that sound of water, is important to me culturally, and it restores my sense of place. And it also goes to private spaces. So why is this guy sitting here outside of his tent with a pair of scissors cutting his front lawn? Cutting his front lawn, a pair of scissors. He has to walk quite a distance carrying the water that is going to water that lawn and water those plants. It means he values it. And when you ask him why he is investing so much time and energy, because it reminds him of home in Syria. So this process was about really getting into the social media and looking at the gardens and spaces that people were creating in the refugee camp and how that works. So, how do culture and cultural heritage improve resilience? And I could add a subset to this, reduce trauma. Human beings need continuity. As Elizabeth said, they hate change. We need continuity. What is that? That's called ontological security. It's a sense of order and a sense of continuity in your experiences. It instills confidence and trust, and also security that we have a place that we can live, that we can be in, that we won't get kicked out of again. That's ontological security. Fundamental to us as human beings. Cultural heritage also teaches us who we are and where we came from. Heritage is the validity to exist, to belong to locations, and it means the ownership of a certain place. That place may change, but we have ownership of it. And interestingly enough, ignorance of the past, ignorance of our heritage, makes us vulnerable to disconnection and vulnerable to groups that would have us be frightened, scared, and also lead to very many of the conflicts that we have in the world. Heritage is not static. It's constantly growing, constantly changing. But there are pieces that we bring with us that become very important to who we are. and how we create our communities. So the more we don't know about the past, the more we let extremists tell us about who we are. So I'm going to finish up with current research, which is coming back to this idea of real home, new home, we've moved. I always thought, so we've got ecosystem change. I talked about the Joshua tree. But I always thought distance had an impact. If you were going farther, you were more concerned about recreating your home. And I realized this year, and we have an international consortium that is doing work on disaster response. And we're integrating medical response, infrastructure response, and cultural heritage placemaking response together as a group and as a coordinated whole. And the disaster response is about disaster planning, immediate response, and then really about long-term support for those displaced communities. So I thought that distance mattered, but it turns out, no, distance doesn't matter. We went this April to Italy to see 3 communities, 2 which had been destroyed in the 2016 earthquake. So we're 8 years past the earthquake. And 1 community that had been destroyed in 2009 in a different earthquake. This is Amatrice in Italy in 2016, just after the earthquake, where the town is flattened. Except for, you can see the medieval town square spire here in the center. And what does it look like in 2024? You would think in 8 years we might have rebuilt. That's the reality of constant recurring disaster. So when we think about slow onset disaster and how many times you're willing to have your house flooded, this is the kind of stuff you're looking at. So in Amatrice, we talked to people about their experiences, and they were incredibly frustrated that their town had not been rebuilt. They were living in what was temporary housing. As we went to Accumoli, a town very close by, I realized that in Accumoli, people were recreating their village landscapes in their temporary housing, tiny little front yards. And they were creating these little vignettes that were about placemaking to them. So they were dislocated from their town. There was nothing left of their town. Accumoli was the same thing. It had the medieval spire in the center there, and that was it. But they were starting at a very small scale to give themselves a sense of place and a sense of ownership, even in this area of what was called temporary housing. So where do we go from here? We're on a multi-year research project. And so we're looking at the continuity of traditional knowledge in terms of where to build, how to build. If the medieval spire is still standing, there must have been something good about the construction of that versus later buildings. It's about maintaining agency, meaning community engagement and political power. That has come out as one of the primary pieces of how do you make communities function again and how do you reduce trauma, is give them some control. And in Italy, we found very little control was given to the local communities. And then reinforcing this idea of ontological security and the icons of place, the communities should be able to identify, in terms of maintaining agency, what their icons of place are. And for Amatrice, it was the bells. The bells of the churches. There were multiple churches in this town that were flattened. And the first thing that the townspeople wanted to do was put the bells up so that they could hear the bells ringing every day, which is what they did. And then take those other icons that they remember and dig them out of the rubble. And this is a medieval piece of statuary that was dug out of the rubble. There were hundreds of pieces that are now in a museum waiting for reconstruction of some of the churches. But that's the key. Local control, making sure that people can identify their place again and find some sense of continuity in their world, even if they've been dislocated across the Atlantic or across the Pacific to another country. Thank you.
So I know that we're at time. I want to give the people who need to leave a chance to slip out quietly, but hopefully if you have a minute, you can stick around and we can ask some questions of Professor Brabec and Professor Infield, so we can draw some connections between their two work. And can we just do another quick round of applause for both of our speakers? So do we have questions for either or both of these speakers?
We gave you a lot to think about. And it's frightening. It's frightening stuff. It really is.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you both for such an incredibly timely and important talk on such an important, timely important topic. Elisabeth Infield, picking up your last comment about, you said retreat is the first, not the last option, and we're also resistant to change. Like, you mentioned that, you asked how many floods or how many disasters do you have before you are willing to move/retreat? And then you also mentioned the example of the increase in insurance rates. I mean, what does the literature say right now on what the strategies are in terms of a more proactive approach versus these more just kind of systemic drivers that are just forcing people out, like these extreme examples of just an extreme event, or the insurance rates just making it untenable to stay in place?
So there's not much yet about the insurance. Like, this thing has just bubbled up this year where everybody's like, oh, this is bad. So I don't think, and some states have put together programs, but like I said, there's really significant problems with that. For one thing, it encourages people to stay in place. Like, it doesn't give them the information about how risky their property is if they can just go and get insurance from the state or the feds. Right. So, like, I don't know what the solutions are for the insurance. But the retreat, I think it's probably going to be easiest if we have a plan in place. Let me back up and say, like 10 years ago when I started this, and my colleagues would say, oh, you need to have a after disaster plan that's ready to go. And I'm like, yeah, nobody's going to do that. But I think more and more people, towns might do that. Go like, okay, you can stay in that house until that house floods. And then if 5 out of 10 of these houses are damaged, you're gonna have to move. And that's just the way it is. So that there's some foreknowledge of the change that's coming, because people hate change, but they mostly hate change that they didn't see coming is even worse, bigger equity problems. So I think the more that we can give people some foresight about the change that's gonna happen, the more agency they may have, because then they might go like, oh, okay, I'm selling the house now. Something like that, you know? I don't know, it's a great question,
Super complicated.
super complicated.
And another piece of this that has bubbled up this year that I just became aware of is there are a lot of homeowners insurance policies that have exclusions. And one of the ones that could hit us really hard is an exclusion for wind damage. Because we don't expect to have wind damage, right? But wind damage is becoming more and more common. So it's excluded already in the property insurance. With the increasing amount of wind damage, this can leave some homeowners really without any support. And I think that's as much interesting as anything else, where they could write policies with exclusions where you were like, yeah, that's never gonna happen. Or that could happen once in 1,000 years, so it's not even worth insuring for. I'll just take that policy. And now you can't get it anymore if you don't already have it.
Other questions?
Another doomsday scenario.
I have another insurance question. I'm curious about like areas where they're building like luxury high rises and like business centers that are at high risk. Like I'm thinking of Boston Seaport, because I would assume insurance isn't dropping out of that area as opposed to dropping out of areas that maybe are like more affordable housing or like residential. Just curious your thoughts on the differences there.
Yeah, I don't think there's any insurance droppage in Massachusetts yet. It's mostly like Louisiana, Florida, California. Some parts of the Midwest are actually having a lot of trouble getting insurance now because they've had so many tornadoes. So I think Seaport is okay. And the luxury property is, I don't think it's as big an issue, but affordable housing.
I would agree, but
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it seems like insurance, I was thinking maybe like insurance is dropping out of some areas more than others, and that is not just, I guess.
Yeah, you know, there's this funny sort of glass wall between like the business scholarship and then all the social science scholarship. And like I'm trying to slowly pierce that black wall so that I better understand what's going on, but it's like, it's
Yeah,
it's really
the
interesting.
risk is just over their heads.
So, yeah. Yeah.
We have one more question? I have a question. I'll take the last one. We often tell the story of migration in America as a positive thing, like we're moving to greener pastures, we're going, there's opportunity out west, that sort of story. And that's not the story that either of you told, but I wonder if it's come up in either of your research that, this is gonna be a better life for us when we move.
Yeah, so the last big migration was during the Dust Belt, right, in the 30s. And at that time, people moved primarily to California. And they, as essentially climate refugees at that time, as refugees to California, they were ostracized in California. People were trying to keep them out. And so I know that's not quite what you were asking, but I think the negative, and we tend not to remember the negative pieces of this, when there is mass migration, the response tends to be negative. Keep them out. We don't want our community to change. And that, I think, is our real issue that we have to deal with as landscape architects and as planners, is how do we get those communities to talk to each other and to integrate? the incoming and the existing. How do we get those existing people to not say, we're happy as we are, you can go somewhere else. And that's the fundamental problem internationally at least, because everybody are closing their borders.
Just going a little further back, I'm thinking about the great migration of African Americans from the deep South in the Jim Crow era up into the North and the Midwest. And a lot of the vibrancy of our cities is an outcome of that migration. Like, we would be so much poorer culturally and in all kinds of ways if we hadn't benefited from the inflow of those folks. So, not to say there weren't challenges and they faced redlining and a lot of discrimination, but that was a slow movement for individual reasons. Like, I can't, like, this is not a way to live anymore. I'm going north and I'm getting an industrial job. And so they did really move for a better life, and it created a better cities and better communities. So I think it's entirely possible, but you're right. We have to have some positive narratives, you know? I could think about this a lot, where we go like, oh, this will be great. We need people. In a lot of places, like, we need people.
Well, thank you again, Elizabeth and everyone, please come back next week.